So this video isn't specifically about proprioception or the vestibular system or even somatosensation in general, but it's a good point in the course to talk about an idea called sensory adaptation, and I will give a couple examples here directly related to proprioception. So what is adaptation? Adaptation could be defined as the change in responsiveness of a sensory system, especially after a constant stimulus. So if for example, a smoker has been smelling smoke for a long time, right? They might stop noticing the smoke smell of their clothes or their car or their home, even if it's obvious to a non-smoking visitor. Or likewise, if a guy puts on heavy cologne or body spray, he may stop smelling it, right? Despite the fact that the smell is still strong to everyone he walks past. Or another example of adaptation might be if you put your hand in hot water, like around 120 degrees Fahrenheit, it'll initially be painful, but the pain quickly goes away, just like adjusting to a hot shower. So those would be adaptations, sometimes called sensory adaptation or neural adaptation. They mean the same thing. So it's our nervous system, our sensory system adapting to something that you keep getting the same stimulus, the same input, the same smell, the same touch, whatever it is, then you just stop perceiving that thing after a while. So sensory adaptation is good. It's actually super helpful and important. We notice new things or changes in our environment, but then after a while, those things fade into the background and we don't notice them. Otherwise, you'd be overwhelmed with sensory information all the time because you'd constantly be noticing every tick of the clock in the room, the sound of the AC blowing, the sound of background traffic, the sound of your own breathing, the sound of your heartbeat, and everything else all at once. Not to mention constant awareness of all your clothes touching your body in all the different places, the feel of your shirt against your skin, constantly noticing that you're wearing pants, always aware of how tight your tie is around your neck all day long. You lose your freaking mind. So instead, sensory adaptation means we stop noticing it until something new and interesting happens that might be important information. A new sound, a new smell, a new touch. So when your dress strap maybe slides off your shoulder, you notice the change, right? And that's important. But moments earlier, you weren't noticing the dress strap that was just sitting there on your shoulder, on your Merkel discs, activating your touch receptors. And sensory adaptation mechanisms, they work in both the short and long term through these like neural mechanisms at the receptor level as well as the brain level, as we'll see. Like, if you want an example of this, maybe if you wear like a watch or a bracelet every day and always on the same hand, try just moving it to the other hand and you will notice it so much more throughout the day. But after a week or so, the new hand that it's on will start to feel normal. You won't notice it as much. Likewise, if you move to a place near an airport, right, you'll notice the planes taking off, the sound of that all day long. But after a few months of living there, you'll rarely notice the sounds of the airplanes. The baseline sensitivity of neural response to sensory information, it seems to be at least partially determined by long-term adaptation to the environment. So long-term and short-term, we'll see examples of both. Because we can also see neural adaptation in the very short term by, in essence, basically just tiring out or fatiguing our sensory receptors. So let's do a demo. Let's see an example of that now for our visual system. So on the next slide, I'm going to show you a flag picture, just a picture of a flag, green and yellow. What I want you to do is just stare at the white dot in the middle of the image. So once I move to that slide, try not to move your head around and don't move your eyes if you can help it. It's totally fine to blink. You can blink normally. Just don't move around. Don't look at it from a different angle. Make sure you keep looking at the dot in the middle. So here we go. Stare at that white dot in the middle without moving your head around. Just keep staring at it as I'll count about 30 seconds out here. So it's totally fine to blink. Just keep looking at it. That's about 5 seconds, so it'll be a little while longer. Just keep looking, keep staring. And in a little bit, so it's been about 15 seconds, so in about 15 more seconds, when the time is up, I'm going to switch to a totally blank white slide. Okay, so the next slide, there's no picture, there's no colors on the screen, it's just a blank white slide. And when I do switch to that new screen, I want you to keep looking at the same spot on the screen where you've been looking. So it's been about 30 seconds. So here we go. Keep staring where that dot is. Don't move your eyes. And now, what do you see? You're probably seeing something. Despite this being a totally blank slide, you're probably seeing something like an American flag with red, white, and blue with the stripes and stars. It'll stay even if you blink. You know, it'll fade after a little while, after a few seconds. But even if you move your eyes around, that might make it fade a little bit faster. But you can even project it on a blank wall near you. Studies have shown that the after image, so this is called an after image, the after image projects out at a given distance, like your brain perceives it as at a certain place in space, even though it's all in your head, it's all in your brain. But you don't just perceive the color and shape blankly, you perceive it as projected out at a certain distance in the world. So with an after image like this, if you're looking at a far away white wall after staring at that last slide, you'll see the flag, but you'll see a very large American flag shape that's very far away from you, that's out where the wall is at that distance. But if you're looking at an up close screen after staring at that last slide for a while, you'll see the after image, the American flag picture, you'll see that as a smaller screen-sized American flag shape at the distance of your screen. So anyway, how does an after image like this relate to this idea of adaptation that I was talking about, where your sensory receptors get tired and stop noticing things that aren't changing? How does an after image like this relate to that? What does it have to do with tiring out those receptors? Why would that make us see something totally different, a new visual perception, colors that weren't even there? So let me try and explain that. What you just experienced, it's a type of after image called a negative after image. Negative because the colors you see in the after image are kind of like seeing a photographic negative. They're opposites of what you were just looking at. So basically, the neurons in your eye and also the neurons in your brain that are part of the visual system, the neurons that fire when you see green, they get fatigued, right? The ones that are seeing the green stripes in that original flag you were staring at, those green detectors get fatigued. The cones basically run out of photopigment temporarily, and their firing slows or stops. So your green detector neurons can't fire as much. You temporarily can't detect green with your eyes after staring at it for a while. But rather than seeing nothing where those green bars were on the flag, your after image on the next slide was of a completely different color, of red. Anywhere you stared at green long enough, you're going to see an after image of red when you look away at a new surface. Anywhere you stared at blue for a long time, you'll see yellow where it was. And vice versa. If you stared at yellow for a long time, you'll see blue where it was. Why is that? Well, it turns out the brain processes color in an interesting way involving paired opposites. Our color system is actually based on 3 opposing primaries. So a black and a white opposing system, a red and a green opposing system, and a blue and a yellow opposing system. What the brain processes, and thus what we kind of experience, it's not really the actual amount of green somewhere in your visual field, but rather the relative amount of green versus red, or the relative amount of yellow versus blue. So the question is, like, is there more green wavelength here or more red wavelength here? That's what makes us perceive green or red. It's the net effect. It's like green detectors and red detectors are in a tug of war, and we perceive whatever color happens to be winning that tug of war, whichever detector is being activated more than the other ones. So if we fatigue and tire out the neurons involved in perceiving green, right? Tire out the green detectors, then red starts to automatically win that tug of war. We perceive red even from just a minor amount of red input, or even just the baseline firing of those red detector neurons. Even if there's no red on the screen, just the baseline firing is enough, since that baseline amount is more than the zero firing of those tired out, fatigued green detectors. So red wins the tug of war by default. We'll come back to this opponent process theory of color later in the course, but it turns out the brain uses this opponent process kind of wiring or setup for more than just color. So we can get after images and after effects for things other than color. Let's see an example with the motion detectors in your visual system. So here I'm going to play this video. It'll show you this spinning spiral pattern for 40 seconds. And you just need to watch the center. So where it says 40 right now, keep your eyes on that circle in the middle. while it counts down. It'll count down 40 seconds, then it'll go 30 seconds, 20 seconds, 10 seconds. It's fine to blink, but don't move your eyes or head around much. Just look at the center. And then at the end of the countdown, it's going to show you a static picture. And let's see what you see. I know the background music is corny, but just stare at the 40. Now we've got 30 seconds left. Just keep staring at that circle in the middle. Ten more seconds. Keep looking there. And again, when this is up, it's just going to switch to a static image, just an outdoor scene. And there's no movement in this image. Those clouds are not moving at all. There's no motion in that picture. So you can see as I move through the thing here at the end, it's totally static. There's no actual motion, but people perceive motion. We see it as moving around, almost like storm clouds moving around, and that's because of that opponent process wiring in our visual motion detection system. Basically, we wore out, we fatigued the motion detectors that go in one direction, so when looking at a neutral, non-moving stimulus, the baseline firing of the opposite motion detectors is now going off. And that wins the tug of war balance over the detectors for the other motion that we've tired out and fatigued. So you perceive motion in that opposite direction of what you wore out. Let's do one more example of this, but we'll do it just for straight up and down motion detection. So in this video, once again, you'll just stare at the dot in the middle for about 30 seconds, and at the end, it's going to show you a static picture without any movement at all, but see what you perceive. So it'll start in a second. Just stare at that kind of purple dot there. Try not to move your head around. Try not to move your eyes around too much. Just stare at the dot. You can blink if you need to, but just keep staring at that purple dot. It'll go for about 30 seconds. So it'll seem like a while because obviously you're not moving your head around. It seems kind of boring, but it'll be really interesting in a minute when it switches at the end of the 30 seconds and it's going to show a static picture of something. Now, most people, if you keep staring at that dot in the middle, most people will perceive like the waterfall there moving downward, right? We were just watching a bunch of upward motion, but now we perceive we perceive downward motion that's not actually there in the image. Again, this is a static image. There's no actual movement in the waterfall picture itself. So this is actually called the waterfall illusion. It's a type of motion after effect. So just like we had the negative after image for colors, this is a motion after effect, kind of like an after image. But instead of the opposite color, you perceive the opposite motion. Neurons that fire for downward moving visual stimuli, they get fatigued and fire less. Or in our case, what we watched was a bunch of upward motion. So neurons that fire for upward moving visual stimuli get fatigued and fire less. But that means the baseline firing of neurons that detect its opposite, in this case, the baseline firing of our downward detectors, is going to seem relatively high at the end of that video, right? Just looking at the static image, the baseline firing of the downward detectors is higher relative to the upward detectors, which are just not firing at all because we tired them out. So what we perceive is basically the balance or the net of stimulation to the downward detecting neurons and the upward detecting neurons, which are wired together in this opponent process, opponent wiring. So if some of those get fatigued, which means sensory adaptation, right, and they don't even fire at their baseline rate, then the balance is just going to be interpreted as the opposite, like upward or downward motion. Now, turns out the same kind of opponent wiring occurs in our proprioceptive and motor systems. You can experience a sort of proprioceptive after effect due to adaptation in something we call the invisible ball trick. You will need a partner or a friend for this to help out. I'll show you a solo version in the next slide though. You can take turns, so you and your partner or your friend can take turns being the participant. Only one person will do it at a time. The other is just an assistant. What you want to do as the participant is stick your hands out in front of you about shoulder width apart, but aiming the palms inward toward each other, kind of like you would if you were holding a light box from the sides, okay? Now, your partner is then going to put their hands just outside of your hands. They will be holding your hands in place as you try and push outward. So what you as the participant would do for about 30 seconds or so, maybe 40 seconds, you'll push outward with the backs of your hands. You're pushing the backs of your hands out against your partner whose hands are holding you in place. You don't want to actually move your hands much. The idea is not to win and push the other person out of the way. It's just to tire out those neurons as you push and push and push against your partner's hands. So really tire those neurons out. Do it for about 30 or 40 seconds and then stop pushing, and your partner can now pull away. And now with your hands just hovering there, just sitting there, that same distance apart, just slowly and gently try to push them together. Maybe pull them apart a little and then bring them back together. Try and pull them together. And as you push your hands together, as you try and bring your palms together towards each other, you may perceive a force acting against you, almost like there's an invisible ball between your hands keeping you from bringing them together. And that's due to adaptation of those neurons, and with the opponent process wiring a feeling in the opposite direction. So again, adaptation happening both in the proprioceptive and the motor systems in this case. For a solo version, if you don't have a friend to do this with at home, you can do basically the same thing, sometimes called the floating arm trick. You may have done this before. For this, you just need to stand in an open doorway, one that's not too wide, so that you can have your arms out by your side. And then you push the back of your hands out against each side of the doorway. Push. And again, you want to do this pretty hard. You want to really be pushing to really tire it out, but do that for about 30 to 40 seconds. And then afterward, you can step forward, step out of the doorway, just relax your arms a little, and you'll feel them rise or float up on their own. It's really weird. It's called the constam phenomenon, that sustained muscle contraction. It causes adaptation. Likely, in both, evidence suggests it's both in the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system that we get adaptation effects there that feed into this. Now, different neurons code limb movement and force in opposing directions, right? So what we're talking about here is an opponent process wiring for our movement detectors, our force detectors, which, proprioception, right, helps with that for tracking how much our muscles are, stretched out or how much tension there is. So when any neuron fires a lot to a constant stimulus, it eventually shows adaptation. We know that, right? Meaning reduced response. Basically, they get fatigued, they have to recover. Arms pushing out would be a constant stimulus. So those neurons are adapting and firing less than they should. And the new balance in the opposing outward or inward signals, that's what causes an illusory perception of motion until those original neurons recover. A cool example of this is actually in the study I've shown here from back in 2007. I've just put the abstract here, but you can look up this study. It's open access. So you can read the whole thing without any sort of subscription. What they did is they used that vibrator trick that we saw in the proprioception video. Remember the vibrating, like the biceps or the triceps, can cause this illusory motion. It can trick your brain into feeling like your arm is contracting or extending out, right? So they use that vibrator trick to cause these sorts of after effects, motion after effects in the proprioception system. So they applied a vibrator to the biceps, and it gave that proprioceptive illusion of the arm moving, even though it wasn't. They did that. They didn't just stop there, right? So we've done that before. You get the expected illusion of elbow extension. But then they did that for like 6 minutes long. So they kept doing it for a long time, which means adaptation occurs. And then after stopping, adaptation occurs, meaning they stop perceiving that anymore. And then after stopping, what they found is a reversal happened. People perceived movement in the opposite direction. So after vibration, there was an after effect in which the stationary elbow seemed to move into flexion in the opposite direction of where they were feeling it. So that's that opponent process wiring, right? Opposites. So this was actually separate from any effects on the motor system. So it's specific to sensory information in proprioception. And you can see from their conclusion sentence of the abstract here at the end, that this gives evidence for the central nervous system, so the brain really, having opponent process wiring for opposing movement directions in our proprioception system. So it's not just vision that has this kind of wiring. We will see a lot more about that when we do our vision topics. But now we can see this applies even to proprioception. By the way, there is another version of this stuff you can try at home, or maybe you've even done this at a sleepover party as a kid, but we call this kind of the ghost arms trick. So for the ghost arms trick, you can make it feel like your arms are floating into the floor, like part of your body is passing through the floor. It's really fun. It feels weird. It does require a partner to help you out, though. So what you do is you lie on the ground face down on your stomach with your arms stretched out in front of you, kind of like Superman. So the person in yellow here would be the participant. The other person here is just helping them out as an assistant. So you're laying there like Superman with your arms stretched out in front of you on your belly. Keep your head kind of relaxed. You can just let it dangle during this, and you'll be looking down at the floor. But what you'll do is once you're ready, you close your eyes and keep them closed for the whole experience. So don't open them up the whole time. Now relax your arms a little out in that Superman pose in front of you. Just relax them a little and have your friend grab your arms and raise them up. Slowly raise them up about 2 feet off the ground and hold them there for 1 minute straight. Obviously, your friend should go slow and only go as far as you can comfortably manage. Don't jerk the arm back further than it goes or dislocate anything. You just want a really good stretch for about 1 minute with your friend's help. And again, you have your eyes closed the whole time here. Then when the minute is up, keep your eyes closed, but they can let go, and you'll want to just very, very slowly lower your arms down toward the ground. So still out in front of you like Superman, they're lifted up off the ground, right? Don't just flop them down immediately when your friend lets go. Instead, you want to slowly, slowly, slowly lower them down, again, with your eyes closed. And as you lower them, it'll soon feel as if they're going below the level of the body, past flat, and into or through the ground. It'll feel proprioceptively like your arms are well below your stomach, which of course, your stomach being flat on the ground means it'll feel like your arms are spatially down inside the floor, like ghost arms. But it's just a proprioceptive illusion. And after effect, thanks to your friend causing sensory adaptation, right? They wore out once you're feeling more downward motion than is actually true. And when you add that to the actual downward motion, when you are literally moving your hands down a little bit slowly, a little bit at a time, it kind of adds that together. The real downward motion plus the proprioceptive illusion of extra downward motion. And that's why you feel like your arm has moved way deep down into the floor. Now, as I said, adaptation happens in the cortex too, in the brain, not just at the sensory receptors themselves. A really good example of this can be shown with what are called prism lenses, basically glasses or goggles with prisms inserted into them that bend the light. You can actually buy cheap ones on Amazon for a couple dollars. They're sold for reading in bed because they bend the light so that you're looking straight out with your eyes, but you can see whatever's straight down. It's almost like you're looking down without having to tilt your head down. But other versions have been used in experiments to like flip the visual field upside down. So like this person, if you watched his eyes blinking, it would look like they're blinking upside down, right? The blinking seems to come from below, not above. It's not, his eyes aren't screwed up, right? It's just the way these lenses work. These prism lenses are flipping everything. So for him, he's seeing the entire world upside down. The stuff at his feet is at the top of his visual field, and the sky above him would be at the bottom of his visual field, which means when reaching out to shake someone's hand, if they move their hand up higher, it'll look like their hand went lower. So you have to kind of reverse your usual action patterns to compensate. Now, other versions of prism lenses have been used therapeutically. So for certain like neuropsychological disorders that can happen after a stroke. For example, unilateral spatial neglect, sometimes called hemi-neglect, where someone has trouble seeing or noticing things on one side of space, like they just don't shave half of their face. They think they're done shaving, but they've only done half of it. They may not finish dressing that half of the body, but they don't notice, they don't realize. They draw pictures with one half missing, or draw a clock with all the number labels from 1 to 12 just on one side of the clock, and they don't notice anything's wrong. They just don't notice or see that other side of space. That can happen. Again, it's a condition that can happen sometimes after a stroke to part of the brain. Well, one promising treatment for that is to have them put on these prism lenses, which shift the visual field like 15 or 20 degrees off to the side. And with enough time, the brain adapts. That's a different, longer term form of adaptation, but the brain learns to adapt to that shifted input. But really, the most interesting version of this was done back in the late 1800s by a psychologist named George Stratton. He did experiments, including some on himself. A lot of his experiments he initially did on himself, where, for example, at one point he wore reversing glasses like this for 8 days straight, making everything upside down. And in the first 4 days, he kind of narrated or wrote down his experience. The first 4 days, it was all upside down. Everything was weird. But around day 5, everything started appearing upright and normal, even though the actual light coming in through the prisms was still reversed and upside down, but his brain had adapted and he started to see everything as normal. But if he concentrated on what he was seeing for a moment, then it would look upside down again. His brain was starting to process it automatically as upright. Basically, he was noticing the long-term adaptation in his brain to the changes in his visual input. And by the way, as weird as this sounds, this is precisely what your own brain did back when you were a newborn infant. So the way our eyes work normally, think about how light comes in from an object we're looking at. So here's like a tree, the distal stimulus out there in the world, light bounces off of it, goes into our eyes, and goes and hits the retina at the back of our eyes, right? So the distal object out there, like the tree, has the green leaves spatially at the top, right? And the roots are spatially at the bottom here. So the green part is up top, roots at the bottom, but then follow the lines here. Follow the lines as it gets to the back of the retina, and you'll see the light that bounces off the top of the tree goes into our eyes such that the light from the top of the tree, from the green leaves, is hitting the lowest part of our retina at the back of the eye. And the roots at the bottom of the tree are hitting the highest part of our retina further up. So the proximal stimulus that's projected onto our retina, the info our brain gets during normal vision, is in fact upside down. Every moment of every day, the info coming into our eyes comes in upside down. The whole world is upside down. So why don't we see it that way? In other words, why don't we perceive it that way? Why doesn't it feel all topsy-turvy? That's because as a little newborn baby, fresh into the world, your brain had lots of time to experience this, to correlate the visual image with your own movement, where a downward proprioceptive movement of your arm would move visually upward, and over time your little baby brain adapted to that. Our brain learns from infancy to automatically flip the image and experience the visual world right side up, and that's all thanks to long-term adaptation, just like George Stratton found when he did this himself for 8 days. Now, that Stratton guy back in the 1890s, he did an even crazier version of this stuff to show how the brain adapts. He actually set up a pair of mirrors held up by a special backpack kind of device that he wore for 3 days straight. The mirrors were set up so that it showed his eyes a view of his own body, but from directly above. Like when he went to shake someone's hand, he would visually see the perspective from directly above with a hand down there just kind of jutting out as he watched from above rather than from his eyes perspective. Imagine trying to eat cereal, but to bring the spoon to your mouth, it's like controlling a robot there from a platform above the robot rather than from the robot's point of view. Initially, this led to incredible visual confusion, and he sucked ass at manual tasks. Here's a quote, for example. He says, "Almost all movements performed under the direct guidance of sight were laborious and embarrassed. Inappropriate movements were constantly made. For instance, in order to move my hand from a place in the visual field to some other place which I had selected, the muscular contraction, which would have accomplished this if the normal visual arrangement had existed, now carried my hand to an entirely different place." In other words, he tried to make one motion that normally would make sense, but it went to the wrong place because his vision was off. So, objects lying at the moment outside the visual field, things at the side of the observer, for example, were at first mentally represented as they would have appeared in normal vision. The actual present perception remained in this way, entirely isolated and out of harmony with the larger whole made up by imaginative representation. But After a period of adjustment for his brain to adapt to all this stuff, the harmony did return between vision and action. So over those 3 days, he actually was able to end up doing motor tasks just fine. His work actually set the stage for a ton of research in brain level adaptation. But again, remember that adaptation can also happen in a very short time frame, even just at the level of peripheral nervous system, not even at the brain, like if we just wear out the basic sensory receptors. For example, in a laboratory, we can use tricks to, say, hold someone's eyeballs in place so they can't move their eyes around at all. I mean, we even do this sometimes, or have done this in the past sometimes, by just injecting a little paralyzing agent into the eye muscles. It's temporary, but it means the eyes just can't move at all during that time. Or what we might do is hook up a little projector, basically a little screen, a little visual projector, onto a contact lens so that when they move their eyeballs, if their eye moves a little to the left, the projector moves with that eye movement a little to the left, meaning that moving the eyes around doesn't actually change the visual field. So instead of looking to the left and getting new information, you look to the left, you still see the same projector right there. So moving your eyeballs around doesn't change the visual field at all. This is a trick we can do in the lab that lets us control exactly where information is hitting in the visual field, like exactly what light or what input is going to what part of the retina. And this is important because normally during the day, your eyes move around quite a lot. Even when you don't think they're moving, even when you're staring at something, like staring at that little dot during the demos, your eyes are making tiny little movements called micro-saccades. Basically, your eyes are jiggling just the tiniest bit, little involuntary jerks happening all the time. This is actually really important for being able to see at all. Why? Because of the sensory adaptation effects we've talked about. So let's put it this way. If we hold the visual field totally still and then project a picture or some letters onto that part of the eye, that means the person keeps seeing that same exact input at that same exact bit of their retina. If we do that, which we've done in the laboratory using these tricks, do that after about 30 seconds or so of the same visual stimulus hitting the same parts of their retina, that image or parts of that image start to disappear. Like you can kind of see in diagram B here on the right. Whatever neurons detect that angle of line that makes up a side of the triangle or the side of the letter H, those neurons will tire out. That's sensory adaptation, right? They adapt and they stop firing as much to that same input, which means we actually stop seeing the shape or the letter. If the neurons aren't firing, we're not going to see or perceive anything there. So it disappears from experience. Even though it's still out there in the world in front of us, the line is still there, we just don't see the line. That's because the brain is no longer getting new information. Right? Nothing is changing. It's totally static at that point. And just like the brain doesn't want us to constantly notice the clock ticking sound all day long or feel our clothes on our skin all day long, sensory adaptation just kicks in automatically. And that's normally a really good thing, right? So in this case, it kicks in and we stop seeing things when there's no new visual input, no change in the visual field. It's not new, it's not changing, so it's not interesting, and we don't need to see it. So it just disappears from visual experience. The brain ignores it. We don't perceive it. We don't see it. Now, the slightest change will bring it back, which is why our eyes have those micro-saccades, those little jiggles I mentioned. It ensures that the visual field is constantly changing just a little bit, enough to counteract sensory adaptation processes, even when we're staring at something, so that staring at a tree doesn't make it actually disappear. But if you were able to hold your eyes totally still, get rid of the little jiggling and actually truly hold your eyes totally still, even if just your fingers on the side of your eyeball, you can hold it in place enough that while you stare at that tree, it will indeed disappear. Okay, now remember, the brain doesn't precisely represent its input. We talked before, like we don't perceive the world exactly how it is. We perceive the world how we are based on our past experience. That's part of it. Well, we don't perceive the world exactly as it is. Now we can see that the brain often constructs a perception, its best guess of the world, based on a balance of input from our receptors and in a way that's biased toward or emphasizes comparisons, like with the opponent process wiring we talked about, and toward detecting change and new information, prioritizing that. And in this case, because of sensory adaptation, when we temporarily tire out part of that perception constructing machine that is our brain, it's basically just miscalibrated briefly, and thus we get illusions. We get illusory perceptions of the opposite of whatever we wore out. Now, I don't want you to worry about the details here, but I do want to just spend a moment talking about some kind of deeper neuroscience-y stuff. So if you're not into neuroscience-y stuff, don't worry too much about this. But for those who might be curious, I wanted to show an example with a very simple neural network model of how just a few neurons might do something like motion detection, how that might work, and in a way that involves opponent process wiring, even with just a few neurons, so that we might get adaptation effects and get those after effects and things like that. So in this case, we're looking at an example with leftward and rightward motion detection. So just detecting, some motion that's gone to your left or gone to your right. And we'll show how a simple neural setup could explain that motion after effect that we get in the opposite direction after we tire out the detector for one direction. So first, think about just a couple of neurons next to each other in your retina that pick up light. So we'll call them neuron 1 and neuron 2 here. Neuron 1 watches a little bit of the visual field right out in front of it, and neuron 2 watches a neighboring little bit of the visual field right out in front of it. Now, assuming something moves through that part of the visual field, like a bird flies in front of you and goes from right to left, if the bird's going from right to left, what'll happen is the bird will go in front of neuron 2 first and set it off, and then just a split second later, the bird goes in front of neuron 1 and sets it off. So for leftward motion, moving to the left, right, neuron 2 fires first and then neuron 1 fires. But for rightward motion, the bird coming in from this side and moving to our right, it's going to turn on neuron 1 first, and then a split second later, it'll hit neuron 2, right? It'll be detected by neuron 2, and neuron 2 will fire slightly later. That timing difference is enough for the brain to distinguish leftward motion from rightward motion, just based on the timing of when those two neurons fire. And that's great. That's great. But we can model this out as a motion detector with just a couple more pieces. So imagine we've got this little, I'm going to call it ML neuron for motion, M for motion, and L for leftward. So it's our leftward motion detector. And we've got this little MR neuron over here. Think of it like a rightward motion detector. Each of these get their input from not just neuron 1 or neuron 2, but from both of them. So they each get input from neurons 1 and 2, but with a little delay built in from 2 to ML and from 1 to MR. This means that when a bird flies leftward in front of us, so going from right to left, it's going to hit neuron 2 first. So it goes here first, turns on neuron 2 first, which is sending its signal straight to ML with neuron 2 first, straight to MR with no delay. Right? And then by the time that it's sends like its delayed signal over here to ML, the bird will be in front of neuron 1, turning on neuron 1, which will immediately send its signal down to ML, and it'll start a delayed signal off to MR, which will arrive way too late to mean anything. But the fact that we had first this delayed signal started from 2 to ML, and then a moment later, this immediate signal from 1 to ML means those two are going to arrive at ML at the same time. They align perfectly, meaning maximal stimulation of this ML neuron of what we're going to call this leftward motion detector. Just given our wiring like this, you can see ML will only go off at its maximal amount if someone activated 2 right before activating 1. And the same idea works for MR on the right, the one that'll help us detect rightward movement. If the bird is moving rightward across the visual field, so coming from the left toward the right, rightward motion, then it's going to activate neuron 1 first, and that'll activate ML, but not enough to do anything, but it also starts a delayed signal towards MR. Meanwhile, a split second later, the bird is now further right and has activated neuron 2, which immediately excites MR, happening right as that delayed signal from neuron 1 arrives. Since they both are exciting MR at the same time, it will go off maximally. Again, if the bird was moving rightward. So again, you can see it'll only happen if something is moved rightward across the visual field. MR only goes off maximally if something went in front of neuron 1 and then in front of neuron 2. That alone is enough to get the idea of motion detection wiring from just a couple little visual neurons. Now, in reality, it might be a little more detailed. Like ML, which only goes off for the leftward moving stimuli, might have an excitatory connection to, let's add a final neuron here, we'll call it neuron D. So maybe there's an excitatory connection. If ML goes off, that makes D go off more. Okay, so that's what we mean by excitatory connection. Well, MR maybe hooks up to the same neuron, also hooks up to neuron D, but MR, which only goes off for rightward motion, right? That might have an inhibitory connection to D. That means that D is going to fire faster than baseline if there was some leftward motion. That'll make D go off a lot. It'll fire less than baseline if there was some rightward motion, because MR went off a lot, so that slows D down. It inhibits D. And then, of course, D will just do its own baseline level of firing if there's no motion detected in that part of the visual field. So now, finally, let's see how this kind of simple wiring, so this is our whole setup, this is our whole model, but let's see how this model, this simple sort of wiring for a few neurons, can get us motion after effects, like that waterfall illusion where we perceive motion in the opposite direction of whatever moving stimulus we were just staring at. So we can see here a system that works really well for detecting motion, but we haven't yet seen how we get opponent process phenomena from that, how we get after effects and perceive illusions in the opposite direction. But it actually comes directly out of this wiring. And let's see how that works. Imagine there's some leftward motion. So first we'll do the situation of imagine there's some leftward motion, like a bird that starts off to the right here and moves leftward across the visual field. But now imagine it's more like the waterfall illusion. Let's say it's an extended, not just a bird moving briefly across the visual field, but some constant leftward motion. Like in that waterfall illusion or in those videos we saw, imagine we have a video with just constant leftward motion for 30 seconds. What'll happen with any leftward motion is the stimulus will turn on neuron 2 and then turn on neuron 1, just like we saw before, but now we might be doing that over and over again for 30 seconds. Neuron 2, then neuron 1, neuron 2, then neuron 1. Do that for 30 seconds or more, okay? Here's what those ML, MR, and D neurons are doing in that case, in that situation. That's what this diagram will show. So let's start with baseline, before any motion happens. Before we turn on the video, ML and MR are just going to be firing at their baseline rates. They haven't detected any motion, so they're just going a little beep, 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 like just a little bit, just to stay alive, a little baseline rate, which means ML is given a little excitatory input to D, MR is given a little equal amount of inhibitory input to D. They cancel each other out. So D is just firing at its baseline rate, which means no motion. So we perceive no motion prior to starting the motion video. That makes sense, right? We haven't started the video. We shouldn't perceive any motion. Then we turn on the video. So then during the motion when the video is playing and constantly giving a leftward motion stimulus to our eyes, what happens to ML and MR and D? Well, it's leftward motion. So neuron 2 is always going off just before neuron 1, which means ML will be going off strongly. ML will be firing like crazy, right? Well above baseline. While MR will be going off at its baseline, or maybe even a little below baseline. But that means lots of excitation going to neuron D and very little inhibition, or relatively less inhibition going to neuron D, which means D will be going off like crazy. D will be going off above baseline. And remember, when D fires a lot, that's always for leftward motion. That's what makes us perceive leftward motion, because it's a reliable indicator that something hit neuron 2 right before neuron 1. Which is leftward motion. So D's firing like mad for those 30 to 40 seconds because we're watching a video with constant leftward motion for 30 or 40 seconds. This all should make sense. Nothing weird, no illusion here yet. But now what's going to happen after the motion, when the video ends after those 30 to 40 seconds. Now, the ML neuron is fatigued, right? That was the one that was firing like crazy for 30 or 40 seconds. That's enough to tire it out. It has sensory adaptation. It becomes harder to turn on. It basically stops firing or fires much less than baseline now, even for static or non-moving visual input, like when you go to the plain non-moving image afterwards. So ML is turned off. Well, MR might keep doing its baseline rate of firing, right? Its baseline rate, but that's just doing the same thing, the same as usual. But that means MR is inhibiting neuron D. It's inhibiting neuron D the same amount as usual, which normally would get canceled out by the baseline firing of ML like we had here. They cancel each other out, but now ML can't cancel that out, which means D itself is getting inhibited. The net effect on neuron D is that it's firing less than baseline, which remember normally means rightward motion. It leads us to perceive rightward motion because in normal circumstances, a low rate of D firing is indicative that something hit neuron 1 before neuron 2. In other words, it normally only fires like this for rightward motion, so that is what we perceive. When neuron D fires like this, we perceive rightward motion. In this case, boom, we're getting an illusory perception of motion that isn't actually there, a motion after effect. But it's caused entirely by sensory adaptation happening, again, just to ML here getting fatigued and worn out. If that happens in a simple little network of neurons like this that were there just for detecting motion, you can see as a side effect, we're guaranteed to get those illusory opposite direction motions with a wiring like this. So that might be why we have the waterfall illusion and things like that. And of course, the same setup would explain things if we tire out the system with 30 to 40 seconds of constant rightward motion. So it's just the same diagram, but in reverse now, right? So we fatigue the MR neuron. So even when the real motion stops, MR is just tired out so much that it automatically loses the tug of war, which means ML is winning. Even when there's no leftward motion, it wins by default. So the baseline firing rate is enough to kick D into kind of relative overdrive. It's not getting inhibited as much as normal, so we're going to perceive illusory leftward motion in that case after we stared at rightward motion for 30 or 40 seconds. That means this simple 5-neuron model is sufficient to explain all of that stuff we talked about. And remember, of course, that we have tons and tons and tons more neurons than this, both in the peripheral nervous system and then, of course, in the brain and along the way to the brain. So we can easily cover all possible combinations of motion in all possible directions for all parts of the visual field. And that doesn't even take that many neurons relative to how many we have total.